Hey everyone, we're here in the studio. Today's video is a pretty short one, so I just wanted to give a quick little intro to talk about what we're going to be working on. If you've been watching my channel, you know that I started off with building some garage shelves and then moved into a workbench. And I went to the store one time and bought all of the material to make both of those projects with a little bit of excess. And since then, I've been able to build quite a bit of other stuff just from the scrap materials from there. And today's video is no exception. If you work in a shop or you have a little bit of a shop at your home or you like to build stuff in your garage, you probably know the value of a clamp. If you watch videos online about how to build stuff, you'll inevitably find a whole lot of DIY channels. And one of the things that they all seem to joke about is that you can never have enough clamps. And while this seems to be true, another issue is where to put all of these clamps. For me, I had them all kind of shoved into one drawer and they sort of get tangled up. It's hard to find. I had other things in the drawer and it was just a big mess. When I needed a clamp, I had to take pretty much all of them out to find the correct one, and then later putting it all away. What a chore. During the miter saw build, I ended up purchasing a really big clamp, and that obviously wasn't going to fit in the drawer either. So I needed to come up with a solution, and that's what today's video is about. When I put the camera on the top of my ladder, I thought that I was going to end up getting a really awesome shot here, but I really just got a lot of footage of the back of my head. There's a decent amount of wall space above where I keep my toolbox, so I've decided to put the shelf there. Currently, I'm marking the studs, and then I'll get out a tape measure to know exactly how much room I have to work with up here. My main consideration when determining the length of the shelf is to hit 2 studs so that I have plenty of support. But I also want to make sure that I'll be able to get the project done with the scraps that I have. In this first step, you can see I'm just measuring a piece of cut off plywood that I have from the table build that it happens to be sitting on. This happens to be plenty long enough to fit in the space quite well, which meant that I was able to pick any length that I wanted. Now, in the interest of education, I'm going to go ahead and show this next clip, and we're going to talk about the multitude of problems. When you take into account the fact that this board is too wide for my miter saw to cut, and the fact that my blade is dull, that's a lot of smoke. Also, I'm not wearing any PPE. I'm picking up the board here to inspect that it's not actually on fire. Seeing as it wasn't, I decided to continue cutting. Well, maybe not. Maybe I should take another look at this. Now, because I don't have a sliding miter saw and my blade isn't large enough, I decided to transfer the line to the other side of the board, flip it over, and cut from that side. The hope, of course, being that the 2 cuts would meet up and end up being enough to get the board in half. I was definitely concerned about the amount of friction being caused by the relatively dull blade, so I decided to do multiple quick cuts in an attempt to try to reduce the amount of heat. And while this method did end up working, I definitely don't recommend it. The amount of smoke that I created suggests that I was pretty close to catching this thing on fire. Here I've gone over to my scrap bin and grabbed a couple cutoff pieces from 2x4s and trying to find one that will fit without heavy modification. These blocks I'm going to be mounting to the end of both shelves are going to act as the main transfer support for the shelf holding the weight of the actual clamps and the board that is keeping the entire thing on the wall. It's pretty awesome when you're able to use some scraps like this instead of cutting something to length from a larger piece. The sanding that I do throughout this project really has nothing to do with appearance and is all about safety and comfort. If I happen to run my hands across this shelf at some point, I don't want to end up getting a splinter. I'm hitting the flat surface to make sure that it's relatively smooth, and then the sides to get any sort of burrs. I've watched a ton of DIY YouTube videos over the last couple of months about projects like this and ones on much larger scales. And one of the things that I frequently see are little plastic tools that people use for spreading glue around. Initially, I thought that that was kind of silly. You can just use your finger, but then I forget to grab towels, or I end up getting a ton of glue on my finger and just making a mess in general. And I think that some of those tools would probably be a pretty good investment. The vast majority of the structural support for this piece is going to come from those blocks that I'll be mounting in a few moments. So this glue and the nails are really just to hold the two pieces together. It's funny that I managed to get a mask on for one of the parts of the project where it wasn't really necessary. And as is customary with many of my projects, I'll be assembling this with deck screws. While wood glue won't handle nearly as much of the load support as the deck screws that I'll be installing, it's definitely not going to hurt anything. Here is a perfect example to demonstrate the value of pre-drilling. Now, if you don't encounter any problems, it may be slightly quicker to go ahead and just throw these screws in, but it really only takes a few seconds to pre-drill these holes and put the screws in properly. Doing it this way ensures that the screw goes in straight, it goes in where you want, there's no wobble, it's safer, and it only added about 10 seconds to the process. Now, if that previous beat was titled "The Value of Pre-Drilling," this section could be called "The Value of Pre-Drilling Properly." What's going on here is that my drill bit was probably slightly too large, and that there's just not quite enough material left for the screw to bite in. In the event that you don't have the perfect sized drill bit to go along with your screw, you can actually just drill a less deep hole. Then the last bit of length of the screw will have plenty to bite into. I chose to solve the problem with a combination of maybe drilling slightly less, pushing in a little bit harder with the screws, and sometimes using longer screws. Now I'm going to go over this with the sander one more time just to make sure that there's no burrs on the edge and that those locations where two boards meet, there isn't a lip that something could get caught on. And that's it, another completed project. You can see I've got a handful of clamps on there, plenty of room for expansion. I went ahead and threw a couple other screws and mounts up over here to handle some of my other organizational problems. And I'm pretty happy with the way the shop is starting to come together. No reason to get too fancy, all about function here.